So to make a large dinner plate, starting out with 4 pounds of clay or more, the more clay you start out with, honestly, the easier it's gonna be, because people get in trouble when they're trying to make a really wide plate and they don't have enough clay. And when you're throwing to make something wider, you have to stretch those walls, right? And to make it wider, you're also making it thinner and thinner and thinner, and it's more likely to collapse. So I always start with more clay than necessary. Get the clay on the wheel and kind of tap it center. And then when it's somewhat center, I'm going to brace my elbow into my hip bone. It's like bone on bone here. And that's what's keeping my arms stable. And that clay is just coming into that stable hand and centering. And then the top hand is really just guiding it. Okay, so to make a plate, anytime you're making anything on the wheel, you need to wedge your clay on the wheel as well. So I'm squeezing it to bring it up and collaring the top so it stays flat, so I don't accidentally get a hole in the top yet. I don't want that hole yet. If you do get that hole, it can end up trapping air. So I'm just gonna kind of be cognizant of keeping that deck clean. So once I get it to the top, I'm gonna guide it back down. And then do that process maybe one more time. So notice how I'm always keeping one, at least a thumb on the top, and that's collaring it. So when I'm squeezing it up, the clay will have a tendency to just, the outer walls will come up, but the inside won't, and that's what creates that sinkhole. So if you keep one thumb on the top to collar it, it keeps that from happening. So I can feel the clay is kind of all moving in a very cylindrical way, which is good. I don't feel much resistance on the inside. That means it's centered not just the outside of the clay, but the inside center too, which is the goal. Okay, so now I'm gonna start bringing the clay down to form this kind of patty. And I'm just gonna check at this stage and make sure there's no air bubbles, and I actually feel a little one. So I'm gonna stop the wheel, grab a needle tool, and just poke, poke, poke. And compress that air hole out. Okay, so another thing is when you're bringing the clay down, you want to make sure that you're not getting like a mushroom head, which will naturally happen. But you can just guide that clay down with your fingers so your wall is vertical. So you should have a nice vertical wall. And I always like to, the patty that I start out with, I like to think of that as like, that's gonna be the width of my foot. So if I'm imagining what this plate looks like, and it might be helpful to actually draw the plate before you start, and have like general dimensions of the foot and the rim. Especially if you're making a set, you're gonna wanna do that so everything's consistent. But the patty I start out with is kind of like the width of the foot that I want, right? And then all I have to do is throw that 1 or 2 inches of rim, which is really, really easy. And then I'm gonna be trimming away the foot when this thing is leather hard. Okay, so I'm just gonna clean up my deck again real fast before I start. Get the patty nice and wet. And one hand is going to be kind of cradling the side here, and the other hand is just gently pulling outwards. And I'm just redistributing this clay to create an intentional mushroom head. So now you can see it's starting to bow out like this, the silhouette. And you'll also notice how my right hand is collaring the rim. So I'm not just like pulling it and then letting go. I'm pulling it and then compressing that rim. That's gonna make your rim or your lip a lot stronger. And another thing with plates is, especially if you're working with really wet clay, I prefer to throw plates when the clay is a little bit drier. That's why I always leave clay that's a little dry. And students are like, oh, this is unusable. I'm like, no. It's unusable for what you're doing, but it's good for something else, right? And throwing plates is actually a lot easier when your clay is a little bit stiffer. So I'm gonna come in with this metal rib and compress my plate a little more. And I can feel it, it's really, really wet. So what I'm gonna do, and instead of continuing to work on it, because if I did that, it would just flop on me. So instead I'm gonna pull all the moisture. This isn't quite as wide as I want it, but I'm gonna pull all this moisture off of it. Another thing that students kind of get hung up on is they think it needs to look perfect in every stage of the process. And you can actually end up overworking it if you have that mentality. So you want to be more cognizant of what the clay can handle. You're balancing out what you want and what the clay can do. So I'm just going to stop. I realize that the clay is telling me it has a limitation. And I'm going to hit it with the heat gun, give it a little strength. So if you hit it from the heat gun on the top side, it's going to start curling upwards, which is actually kind of what you want, right? So it's good to hit it from both sides, but particularly from the top. And I'm also bringing this rim up at an angle more than I want it to. But that's fine for now because I can always lay it back down later. By bringing it up just a little bit, that's giving it more strength. So the key to plates, thrown plates, is compression. The more you compress, the stronger your plate will be, and the less likely it is to warp. At this stage, you can kind of, when it's a little stronger, you can begin to kind of formulate your lip a little bit too. Still a little soft. And I also noticed that my lip's a little wonky. Like I have one side that's a little thicker. That's no problem. We can clean that right up. If symmetry is your jam, some people don't mind that. So if you want your rim to be perfectly symmetrical, you can just take your wire cutter and cut off that high point or the thicker point. And then be sure to come back in and compress your lip back. So I personally don't really like that little like nipple. Some people do. I like my plate bottoms to be pretty smooth. Unless I'm adding like slip or something on the bottom. So I always pull that out just by going like this with a metal rib. So I'm pretty close to done. Another thing that people do is they kind of overwork the plate at this stage. And then it ends up flopping. Generally, a dinner plate will be at least 10 inches wide, or the width of, close to the width of your bat, the smaller wooden bats. And snack plates are anywhere from like 4 to 6 inches, or maybe 8. One thing you do want to pay close attention to is the treatment of your rim. You want to make sure that you have, the rim is a little bit thicker generally than the rest of your plate, because that is going to give your plate strength in use and in cleaning and just daily life. It's also pleasing to the eye. It kind of helps that termination stand out aesthetically. And also having that rim a little bit thicker is going to help your plate combat warping. if you have a really, really thick or thin rim, that rim is going to be subject to any tension that's going on interiorly. I made up that word. Is that a word? Internally. Interiorly. But if you have a nice thick rim, it's got a little strength to withstand whatever is going on, right? Inside, interiorly, internally. So that is probably pretty good. Let's check and see how wide we are. Hey. Little bugger. Yeah.
It's supposed to be 10 inches when it's wet like this, and 10 inches after the fire.
We'll say 10 inches wet. This one's 11, so that'll shrink to probably 10. One thing about handmade wares is you always make them and then you're like, dang it, I wish I would have made it a little bigger, right? But we're just practicing. So if you can get to 10 inches, that's great. And at this stage, I will pull it off the wheel and let it sit on my shelf overnight. Ooh, one thing you want to do before you pull it off is you do want to cut it off the wheel head, so it's not shrinking down to the bat. Just cut it once, that should be sufficient. And you're probably going to have to cut it again when you go to take it off the bat. But this will ensure that it's not having any weird tension from shrinking on the bat, because that bat's not shrinking.